Let's take a look at the skeletal system. To describe the functions of the skeleton, let's start by taking a look at the skeleton. You're probably used to images like this, but could you describe all the functions of the skeleton? Some of them are functions that you're probably aware of. For example, support. The skeleton is rigid. It holds our bodies up and provides posture and support and so on. But it also plays a role in movement because muscles attach to bone via tendons. And then as we'll look at in this unit, there are joints in our bodies between our bones. And so as muscles pull on our bones and they move around joints, we produce the movement that we're used to in our everyday life. The skeleton also provides protection. For example, our skull provides protection for our brain. If we were to get hit on the head, the skull provides some protection so our brain is not being directly damaged. Or in the picture here, you can see the rib cage that surrounds the thoracic cavity and part of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and so would provide protection to the organs that lie within those cavities. The skeleton also provides for storage. One of the main things that it stores, as you're probably aware of, is calcium. You often hear that we need calcium in our diet to provide strong bones, but at the same time, calcium can be released from our bones out of storage in order to provide for functions that require the calcium. Finally, blood cell production. This might seem like an odd function of bones. What we'll see later in this unit is that the red bone marrow found in bones provides for blood cell production. So these are the functions of the skeleton. But let's get into the skeleton, break it down using terms for anatomy that allow us to distinguish between the various parts. The first that we'll use here is distinguishing between the axial and appendicular skeleton. These terms may be unfamiliar to you, but we can use some memory tricks to actually remember them here in a moment. But let's take a look at what the axial and appendicular skeleton are referring to. So right now we don't need to worry about all the names of the bones that are indicated here, but we can focus on the pink portion of the skeleton and then the yellow-white portion of the skeleton and distinguish them as pink being the axial skeleton and then the yellow-white being the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is referring, as you can see in the picture here, to the skull, the vertebral column, spinal column, and then the ribs. How I remember this term is to think that this is the main axis of the body, so the axial skeleton, to which we move the parts of our body around. So my arms and legs, which are part of the appendicular skeleton, are attached to the axial skeleton and move around that main axis. For the appendicular skeleton, you've maybe heard the term appendage before. An appendage refers to arms and to legs. What it means is to be added on to something. And so the appendicular skeleton involves our arms as well as the shoulder girdle, the clavicle and scapula, and then our legs, which also includes the pelvic girdle. And so these are appendages because they are added on to the axial skeleton. So now let's describe the various shapes of bones that we find in the skeleton. As you can see, there's all kinds of different shapes, but there are four main categories that we want to take a look at. So the four categories include long bones. So long bones, like the name implies, indicate that the bone is longer than it is wide. And so the example that we're looking at here is the femur found in your upper leg. But we can see even the bones of the lower leg, the bones of the upper and lower arm are all long bones because they are longer than they are wide. Another shape of bone that we have are short bones. And so we can look at the wrist here and we can see short bones are approximately the same width as length. Flat bones, like the bones found in your skull, are just that. They are flat. Your skull is not very thick, perhaps a centimeter and a half. And so in terms of looking at the frontal bone of your cranium here, we have a very large but then very flat bone. And then we have the irregular bones. These are bones like the vertebrae of your vertebral column, spinal column, where we have the main portion, the main body on the left side of the vertebrae image here. But then we have all these processes sticking off of the back. And so this is an irregular bone because it is an odd shape with all these processes sticking off. In this course, we're going to focus on the structure of a long bone. So this long bone is now split in half so that we can look on the inside of it. And let's zoom in a little bit in order to take a closer look. There's lots of lines here, so don't let this confuse you, but we're going to look at the various regions here in order to be able to describe the structure of a long bone. The first portion that we'll look at is the epiphyses. As you can see, at either end of the long bone, there is an epiphysis. The prefix epi, which will come up often in this course, means above or on top of. And so we can see here that the long bone has two ends that are on top, if you will, of the long bone, and so these are the epiphyses. The shaft of the long bone is called the diaphysis. And then within the epiphyses, we have epiphyseal discs. If we were to take the cross section as we have here of the long bone, we can see two lines that are in the epiphyses that are actually fairly solid bone, compact bone, which we'll look at in a minute here. And this is actually the region where that long bone grew as we developed from a young child into an adult. We'll take a look at that in a moment here when we get into that development, but the epiphyseal disc is this area of compact bone found in the epiphyses. In this image, the second epiphysis is not broken open. There would be an epiphyseal disc in that epiphysis as well. On either end of the bone, we have articular cartilage. We've taken a look at cartilage earlier on in this course in tissues, and we talked about various kinds. But in this case, we're using articular cartilage as a general term to describe the joint, the cartilage that comes at a joint. So the term articular is referring to joint. And so articular cartilage means the cartilage at the end of a long bone that is found within a joint. The type of cartilage that it is would potentially be hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. But we're just referring to it as articular cartilage here because it's whichever type of cartilage tissue, but it's found within these joints. There are a couple types of bone that we need to talk about here. For bone tissue, we have spongy bone and we have compact bone. And so a long bone is made up of both types of bone tissue. We can see that the epiphysis is spongy bone, and in fact the spongy bone looks like exactly that, a sponge, where we have little branches and then little spaces in between, and as you can see labeled here, the little spaces in between are actually not empty, but are filled with red bone marrow. And so that's why the spaces are labeled as red bone marrow cavities, because red bone marrow, which we'll discuss in a few moments here, is found within those spaces. Compact bone is found along the diaphysis as well as very thinly around the outside of the epiphysis, and this compact bone, as the name implies, is very compact and does not have the little cavities within it. We have the endosteum, which is the inner lining of the bone within the diaphysis. As you can see, the diaphysis is actually sort of a hollow area, but that is filled with yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is bone marrow that actually has fat within it. Fat is of a yellow color, and so the bone marrow, when you open the bone, is actually yellow in color, and hence its name. But the space that is formed with the endosteum surrounding it is the medullary cavity. So within the diaphysis, there is the medullary cavity that is filled with yellow bone marrow. Then around the outside of the bone, we have the periosteum. To break that word down a little bit, peri, the prefix, is referring to terms like perimeter. Peri meaning around the outside. And osteum is referring to bone. And so the periosteum is this connective tissue that wraps around the outside of the bone. And then finally, there are blood vessels that provide blood, nutrients like glucose and oxygen and so on to the cells that are found within the bone, and then pick up carbon dioxide and other wastes and take them away from the bone. If we move this long bone off to the side, we can zoom in here and discuss compact and cancellous bone. One thing that I should mention is in this diagram, we've mentioned compact bone, but cancellous bone is not labeled. And that's because spongy bone and cancellous bone are two terms but meaning the same type of bone tissue. And so anytime that cancellous bone is being used, you can refer to it as spongy bone. So we can zoom in on the area squared off in the original image of the long bone and take a look at the two types of bone tissue. So on the left and sort of back side of this image, we have compact bone, and closer to the front and sort of on the right side is spongy bone, as indicated at the bottom of the segment here. The spongy bone, as we mentioned earlier, has the branches, which are called trabeculi, with the little cavities between them where the red bone marrow would be found. There's not much else to mention about the spongy bone. As you can see, the compact bone has a much more organized structure. And so the compact bone is made up of the Haversian system, or osteons. And within the compact bone, you would have many osteons repeating throughout. They're showing one in this image sort of pulled out. We'll talk about the ring structure in a minute here. But to the left and to the right, you can see an osteon on either side of the osteon there in the middle, because the compact bone will be made up of many of these systems. The Haversian system has a Haversian canal running down the middle of it. And you can see within that Haversian canal, there are blood vessels. There are arterioles and venules, which are bringing in oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the bone and then removing waste and carbon dioxide away from the cells of the bone. The osteon is forming this or formed from this ring structure. And so what we can see here is that the ring structure is formed up of many canaliculi that form circles that wrap around, and then there's an outermost circle and then another circle around that. And within those canaliculi, you can see the slightly darker dots there with many canaliculi coming off of them. What's going on is inside of those little darker spots are actually the osteocytes, as indicated in the image here. Each of those dark spots has an osteocyte, which means osteo, referring to bone, and cyte, referring to cell. These are the cells of the bone. Ultimately, these are the cells that form the bone, maintain the bone, and as we mentioned, are getting nutrients from the blood vessels and getting rid of waste out the blood vessels. But they form within the compact bone this ring-like and repeating organized structure. And so we've mentioned this a little bit already, but we want to differentiate between red and yellow bone marrow with respect to function and location. So the red bone marrow is found within the spaces in spongy bone in the epiphyses of a long bone. The yellow bone marrow is found within the medullary cavity within the diaphysis of a long bone. The red bone marrow's function is to produce cells for the blood system. So we're talking red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which we'll talk about later, their role once we get into the blood system. But the red bone marrow is involved in production of blood cells. Yellow bone marrow, on the other hand, fills the medullary cavity and is involved in fat storage.